We come to the 29th presentation in this year of the Parayana. What we're accumulating is a pattern historically which gives us a kaleidoscopic view of the growth of civilization important to us because the structuring dynamic of civilization is time in forms, so that time forms are the largest composition theme of civilization, which we now must really understand. Energy, if you can visualize it, moves in such a way that one can graph it and one gets a sine wave readout in technology of energy in its various kinds and types. It's rising energy into incredible power. It's sinusoidal wave signature will always have peaks and troughs that are symmetrical around an inner invisible line, a horizon, and that invisible horizon is time as the first dimension in its dynamic as energy in the universe, spontaneously occurring. And its spontaneous occurrence is such that what we can understand and detect, and finally, now through 21st century technology, come to appreciate from an insight at the beginnings of the 20th century that all quanta of energy are discrete. They are discrete because they do not cause each other. They do not touch each other, though the, quote, space, distance between them is so minute that it's not measurable. And that fact is of great significance to a mature physics, in that time occurs before space. Thus it's a first dimension. And though space instantly blossoms, the instantliness comes from the dimension of time, which does not need a causality at all, but is spontaneously generated within a field that does not register at all, so that it's best to call it a zero field. Current 21st century speculation revolves around 0-point energy, and this is a misnomer, a misunderstanding. As early as 300 BC in Alexandria, Euclid, utilizing his Pythagorean background, was able to write a textbook on geometry called plane, P-L-A-N-E, plane geometry, which is still used in high schools around the world. About the 10th grade, you're given geometry, and it works beautifully well. The very first language as a statement in Euclid's geometry is that a point is a locus of no dimensions, which moves. And when a locus of no dimensions moves, that means, without saying it, that time as a dimension has come into play. Because otherwise there would be no movement. What moves in a zero field? Time. So a locus of no dimensions moving describes a line. The Greek is very clear. Doesn't make a line. It describes, its movement describes a line. And that line can be given a starting point and an end point, but especially it's the dynamic within the field that it occurs that is able then to have a focus, and the focus is in a graphable space. And that four-dimensional space is a diagram that focuses on that center point of that line, which is the middle of its occurrence, and that line then can be said to begin there at that center, and one can then begin to describe that there is an end point to that line from that beginning, and that line will generate in its turn from point to line to plane. And this is the beginning of plane geometry, and from this one can construct an incredible array of mathematical and scientific themes that are good until this day and forever on, no matter where you are. Geometry will hold. There are many developments in it. But what occurs is that we have available a capacity which Euclid had to be able to write his geometry. He got it from the Pythagorean communities that were extremely powerful behind the scenes by that time for about 200 years. And it is that Pythagorean development that has sayings of Pythagoras that are preserved. The sayings of the living Pythagoras, as it were. And one of them is quite puzzling. They're given a listing in a 300s, 4th century AD life of Pythagoras by Iamblichus, Iamblichus. And one of the sayings of Pythagoras, and they're always prefaced by the Greek phrase ipsa dixit, he said, meaning this is testimony from the living source. He said, geometry is history. Meaning that history as time, as civilized time, has forms. It has a geometry. It can be understood. And that those understandings then are able to refine themselves so that the forms of history in their geometry, their geometricality, can be understood finally to be a science. Mathematics is the language of science because it has a geometry which is able to accept an algebra. And once one has something algebraic, the geometry itself evolves into a trigonometry, in which one begins to have the ability to have a geometry not just of plane geometry, but of vectors and of relational vectors that become tensors. And out of this, one can have an enormous development of mathematics and science. And indeed, we have done so. But what has not occurred, except for very few persons of great genius, or by communities of men and women who have learned together in those wonderful ways, but yet small communities, and only occasionally have had the opportunity to have an influence within that history of civilization. And those are the high water markers of the development of civilization to its possibilities, which are here now for us, with the proviso and the understanding that that possibility is time-form cued. And we live at a moment in history where the largest energy dynamic of time forms has just occurred about 1991. So large is this particular kind of time form occurrence that its appearance used to be called, in Pythagorean influenced eras, an age. That there is such a thing as an age, and an age is collectible into a pattern of ages, and the ancient understanding on a worldly level was that there were 4 ages. One can find them described in Ovid's Metamorphoses right at the beginnings, where he's talking about the dynamic of change, of transformation, of metamorphosing, in that the culture, the civilization he was writing in, the Roman Empire, recently established in his lifetime by Augustus Caesar. In the Roman Empire way, the great celebration of Augustus Caesar was that he was the beginning of a new age, an age of gold, where everything is renewed again. It's the fertile springtime of what will be capable of for the next currency of energy in the coming age, beginning with the age of gold. And that subset of that great age was 500-year periods. And the 500-year periods were cycles of the phoenix. The phoenix being not a mythical bird, but being a mystical marker of the way in which an age changes, and not just for a new age, but a new subset of the great age. That 500 years of a golden age has a natural built-in, because of nature, it has a kind of a decay. And after 500 years, the age of gold will give way to an age of something less than gold, a silver age. And that silver age will then have, towards the end of its 500-year period, after 1,000 years, it will reach a quality where the excellence of the golden and silver age begins to atrophy more, and one gets an age of copper. And that age of copper, then after 500 years, will initiate an age of iron, which will be so devastating and corrupt that at the end of its 500-year period, the entirety of civilization will be so corrupt that it will have to be redone initially, basically, by someone who institutes a new age of gold. All of this was a traditional understanding since the time of Augustus Caesar and was passed on constantly and continuously. And so in the late 20th century, groups that had formed in the 17th century, because in the 17th century was a time of another wave of time forms of civilization. Not the carrier wave, the main one, but the forerunner of it, the reference wave. In physics, one always has to take a look at what is the reference to the carrier. These waves are related. In physics, in what used to be called metaphysics, but mostly in the understanding of civilizations. And in the 17th century, 1650, one had the reference wave, which we had in the late closing decade of the 20th century. And so that planning, all that time, resulted in a number of half-learned people who sought to use a standard of collecting and synthesizing and integrating and making sure that they had then the power at the needed node in the late 20th century to usher a new world order. This happened also in the previous set of 4 cycles of the Phoenix, 400 or 500-year periods, 2,000 years before. Because the Roman Empire also set itself up to take advantage of the reference wave then. Augustus Caesar understood. He was not a boy, hardly ever. And he was surrounded by the most powerful people of the age. He saw that the reference wave was the world conqueror Alexander the Great. And so his trigger cue of his moment to establish a new world order was to look for the place at which the reference wave had had its maturity, at its high point. And for him, it resolved itself to Alexander's great city in Egypt, Alexandria, founded by Alexander the Great. And so the whole movement of not just wise and cunning and conniving Augustus Caesar, but of this immense, all the power that one could have mustered at the time, was to take over Alexandria. And the cue for Augustus Caesar was that his uncle, once removed, Julius Caesar, had been involved in the most poignant of all of the power plays in Alexandria, in Egypt, with his relationship with Cleopatra. And so the whole devolvement of the prelude to Augustus Caesar declaring not only the Roman Empire, but something which was startling, and that is to build a temple, not to any god or goddess so much as to have that temple called the Ara Pacis Augustus, the temple of the permanent peace of Augustus of the Roman Empire. And we have talked about that a number of times. We're talking about it again and again because we are devastated now by a new world order that assumes that synthesizing and integrating, collecting together, coming together, tightening the pattern is the key to time forms, and that's not true at all. Not at all. Time is not dependent on what has been caused in space phenomenally, but what occurs spontaneously out of the zero field, which has its great symmetry and complementarity with an infinite field. In ancient Greek physics, that fifth dimension was sometimes called the ether. And one finds that same conviction not only in ancient Greco-Roman civilization, but in India as well. That there is an invisible dimension to the world, and that this invisible dimension of the world is the origin, sourcing, not the cause, of appearances, of phenomenal beings that convey the energy of time into space, and thus space-time has this quality of their movement in such a particular way. And one of the most startling of all of the figures in India who does this is Shiva. And Shiva does this because his movement is choreographed by eternity. And it is Shiva in that dynamic movement of a dance that is called Shiva Nataraja. And it is Shiva Nataraja who dances through the hoop, the flaming hoop of the portal out of which time's energy itself is going to be born, to be freshly, spontaneously here. And it is Shiva bringing this. But in the dance of Shiva Nataraja, he has to have an understanding with a feminine dancer who is equal to him in energy, equal to him in manifesting the power of time, the portals of civilization's energy nodes. And one of her names is Kali. In her destructive quality, that when corruption occurs, she has the power to destroy it, to destroy those who have that. She's incredibly not ugly, not evil, but powerful as a destroyer. And she enters into a dance contest with Shiva, who has as Shiva Nataraja, a 5-part, a quintessential choreography to his dancing. One of them certainly is emergence. One of them certainly is maintaining, sustaining. But the middle one of the 5 is destroying. And it is there, then, at the very pivotal core of Shiva Nataraja's own dance, in the third, the resolving third, the destroying of the old, the destroying of the corrupt. If the fourth and fifth, the rebirthing, the coming through, and the fifth, the eternalizing of it, are to occur, it's there in the destroying that he must win, not win over Kali, but win her acquiescence that rebirth can happen and that eternity can obtain again. In that dance contest, Kali matches Shiva movement for movement, genius for genius, power for power. And there is absolutely no difference between them in terms of capacity, in terms of energy. But Shiva has a movement in that third aspect of the dance of civilization, that he raises one of his legs enormously high up to the crown of his head, up to the area of the Saharastra chakra with his foot, and Kali, with her feminine quality of wanting to demur, exposing her genitalia in that way, will not follow that movement. And through that, she acquiesces to Shiva, not from losing the dance, not from having inferior energy, but for her preserving her femininity, which is preserved. And in the rebirthing, the femininity of Kali is one of the dominant, overseeing qualities of rebirth. It isn't Shiva winning who does it. It is Shiva coming to understand that he has been gifted with the dynamic, the energy, the time form energy of rebirthing, courtesy of Kali, who then has another form of her. And that form of her, in Greek lore, is Aphrodite. In ancient Mesopotamia, she became Ishtar, but before that, in Akkad, she was Inanna. And her story, her myth, her mythos, is commemorated as the work of the first known poet in the world, Enheduanna, the daughter of Sargon of Akkad, who founded the Akkadian great trade route. And she's also the priestess, the N-E-N priestess, the high real priestess of Inanna in Ur, the Ur of the Chaldeans, the Ur where Abraham was born, etc. But the Ur also of the quality that the power of the invisible dimension was not in Akkad, where Sargon was, where the king was, the king of kings, he was called. His name in ancient Akkadian, Sharukan, means the king of kings. In the Bible, he's called Sargon. She has brought all of the nodes of contact, all of the points of access to the power of divinity and brought them not in an integration, but brought them into a new pattern like a tapestry through her 42 temple hymns. And in that way, all of the facets have been brought not to a unity of something, but brought to facets of a jewel. Not a single jewel. And it's not the jewel so much. It's that the faceted quality of the jewel is able to show the full spectrum of possibility of what really carries the energy of the integral, and that is light. The whole spectrum, like a rainbow, but a rainbow of incredible numbers of colors. It is the color of phenomenality, the color of the world, the color of life, that she guarantees by her fertility, and not just a demureness that she will not wantonly expose her sexuality, but that she will hold it as the mystery of mysteries, as a visca piscis portal, which is stronger than circles, stronger than squares, stronger than rectangles and triangles, stronger than the geometry. The geometry of the mind, remember, begins with Euclid's Pythagorean understanding. A point is a locus of no dimensions. When it moves, it describes a line, and lines create then a plane. One of the first books that the Bauhaus used in the 1920s after the First World War was by Kandinsky. It's called Point to Line to Plane. Kandinsky and Paul Klee made the first textbooks, the first instruction books for the Bauhaus, to bring in a new sense of time, space, a new sense of color, a new language of creativity, using the creative imagination to begin not to teach so much, but to guide. A man will want to teach, a feminine will guide, will make that guiding. And it is this quality that in the early 21st century has its ultimate jeopardy now, and its best opportunity for rebirth. That's what this is about. All of this is about that. We're going to take a little break, but something about Aphrodite needs to be said, because she's like a key which we can grasp, which we can understand. It reads here, according to Hesiod's Theogony. Theogony is the study of the gods. Hesiod lived about 700 BC. He's often paired with Homer, whereas Homer lived several hundred years before Hesiod. Homer, born around 1000 BC, wrote his great epics in the early 900s, about the time that Makada was writing the Song of Songs to Solomon. And David had written was writing his Psalms. They're very contemporaries. In fact, one of the great unheralded now scholars, Cyrus H. Gordon, named for Cyrus the Great. Homer and Bible, the origin and character of East Mediterranean literature, that one has to look at Homer and King David and King Solomon and the Song of Songs by Makeda as being contemporaneous with Homer. Not only his two great epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey, but also of his Homeric hymns to the gods, which are hymns, but when they're set into a larger composition, the correct word for them becomes ode, becomes an ode. And so the hymn odes are related like poems and prayers are related. The hymns are like the prayers, the ode like the poems. And they have a quality where one who can do both is called a poet-seer, a seer, a poet-seer. And a poet-seer is one who is able to come out of the vision into the art and reach back and bring the mythos through transformed symbols and give it in a new way through the visionary field along with the nature field into an art which is fertile to transform persons so that they then do not reproduce the old geometry of myths, but they develop the new possibilities of history. That's what we're doing. Let's take a break.